Welcome back to the Rural Roundup. This show is produced in association with the Scottish Government. On today's episode, we're joined by Steven Thomson, an agricultural economist with SRUC, to talk about policy and upcoming changes. But first, Mary Jane, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, George. It's nice to see a bit of sun down here in the Lothians. What's things like with you?
Yeah, we're seeing the sun. For some reason, it stayed away from us for a spell in January and February, and now we're getting it. It's still a bit on the cold side, but it's very, very welcome. And farmers are actually able to get on with things.
Yeah, I would say it's the same down here. It's just been a lovely weekend there into the start of this week, and a bit of sun and a little bit of breeze as well. So drying the ground out a little bit. And I think people are, itching to get on with spring work, thinking about getting ready to start sowing, thinking about getting ready to put fertilizer on if they're not already onto their fields. Is anyone out on spreading fertilizer with you yet?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of people. Winter barley is looking pretty yellow, to be quite honest with you. It, the rainfall we've had since the turn of the year has been, it's been a lot. Put it like that. The crops were struggling. They're looking a bit yellow. Folk are getting on with some nitrogen. They're definitely leaving tracks. There's no doubt about it. But the crop's getting hungry. It's just starting to grow. Same oilseed rape, you just see it just starting to grow this spring as well. It's just that time of the year. It's good to see. It's good to see things starting to grow again. We're kind of out of the winter. Days are stretching, sun shining, and everybody seems to be a lot happier as well.
It does make such a difference. And today's actually, it's the 10th of March. We're recording this. Today is our start of our calving period today. So we've had a few over the weekend there. So yeah, when the sun's shining, it just makes the job a little bit nicer. And yeah, hope to get some turned out in the next few weeks when the grass starts to grow and the ground recover enough to get cattle out on it. So it's always a nice time of year with new life coming and the days stretching.
Yeah. You mentioned the date that we're recording this, and in a few days' time, the Ajax window opens. Big change this year for a lot of farmers is that there's EFA or greening rule changes. And I think we've mentioned this more than once in the past, but a lot of folk are going to have to do greening for the first time. It's definitely worth planning ahead, taking the time to work out what you're doing and seeing if these changes affect you, and also wondering what options you need to do.
Yeah, I mean, some of the options should have started on the 1st of January, so that does limit some of the things that you might be able to do if you've done any management on that land. But for anyone coming into it for the first time, have a good read through the rules, speak to an advisor if you need, and just check that what you're planning is going to be enough, because there's nothing worse than getting to the 14th or 15th of May and discovering that you're short and it's too late to implement something. Some of the options you can implement late if you've not put fertilizer on certain fields, or if you've left bits that could potentially go into some of the low input grassland type options. That might be a get out of jail card. But for a lot of people, if you haven't planned now, really get on with it, because time is running out to make sure that you're complying with all the regulations.
Yeah, it is important. It's 30% of your payment essentially, but having a look at the rules, there's a more flexibility this time around, and generally we're finding there is something for everyone, something that will probably suit your system. So it have a look at the rules or talk to your advisor.
Yeah, there is a handy calculator on the Rural Payments website as well for anyone that's doing greening for the first time or making any greening changes. It's a little Excel spreadsheet you can download. I've used that a few times, so that's quite useful for anyone that's wanting to work it out before the chat to an advisor.
There's also some key deadlines once the Ajax window opens that folk need to be aware of. Anyone who has bought land, sold land, taken on tenancies, renting land that involves and certainly involves entitlements. There's a lot of paperwork needs to go in.
Yep, the land maintenance form is the main way to do that. You can find that on the Rural Payments website under the forms section. There's lots of associated guidance with that depending on what you're doing. But as you say, George, I think for anyone that is transferring entitlements, a key date to remember is the 2nd of April is the absolute deadline for getting the entitlements transferred over, not the 15th of May, same as IAC's deadline. So worth getting them done in plenty of time for that deadline.
Yeah, that form must be received by the 2nd of April. Every so often, someone will appear. They have bought land. They've agreed that they're going to transfer the entitlements. However, they're into well through April or May, and nothing's been done. So please get that sorted out. I think most of the solicitors are nowadays, they are quite aware of that date. But certainly, if you have been involved in sort of land transactions, make sure that side of it's up to date. Also, if you have been making changes to fields, merging fields, splitting fields, chance to probably do it before you fill out your IACs as well. The LFAS system is not too bad now for going on and making changes. In fact, it's pretty good. Changes like merging fields and such like. You do it pretty much. It changes within a 24 hours or so in your map. It's fairly easy to do.
Yeah, and then for those that are less computer literate, you can still do the old-fashioned paper form and hand draw a map, but that is a much slower process. You obviously have to send that into your local department, which they then process it with the LPIS team and get it uploaded. There is a date in May, I believe, where they pause all mapping changes. So again, worth getting that done early. If you've changed something since last IACs, and you know about it now, worth getting that change sorted now. I also think it's worth people thinking about if they've got any parcels that are not registered. We still come across that little bits of woodland and things. Now is, I think, a good time to get them registered because it may be in the future that they're useful for future schemes or whatever. So I always encourage anyone with any white space on their IACS maps just to have a look at it and see whether it could be registered as for agricultural use or for forestry.
Yeah, and something else as well. It can be worth, when you are going through your IACs, having a look at your business details, seeing if there's things changed. Are all the partners correct? Do they need updated? Is there somebody come into the business? Is there somebody left the business? Contact details, all these things. It's worth checking over. We've had grant schemes in the past that maybe you've been relying on new entrants or people under 40. If there's no evidence of that in the system, it becomes harder for the scripted to do those checks.
I think aside from grant applications as well, George, I've had instances where one partner has passed away and the other partner hasn't been listed on rural payments, and we get locked out, and it is a real headache at a time where people are already grieving to then try and sort out paperwork to get them added to the system. When they were legitimately a partner, they just weren't listed on the system. So every year we do that with our clients. So if you're doing your IACs yourself, please, as George says, just make sure it's not just for grants and subsidies. It can be crucial if somebody was to pass away or needing to get into the business suddenly to access payments, to change banking details or something like that.
That's an important one. That last one you said there, bank details. Remember, if you might have changed your bank, but if you don't advise ARPID, they won't know of your new bank account to pay the money into. So it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, there's events going on elsewhere in the world. That we're sitting in the coming up to the middle of March. There's a lot of volatility in fuel prices. Fertilizer prices seem to be being pulled daily and jumping. There's a bit of concern about supply. I think really it's worth making sure that you have got your fertilizer bought for your, whether I suppose it's grassland or whether it's for your crops. Worth working out what you need and getting those orders in. It's one of those times, I'm afraid, that it's a bit more challenging, and the volatility is with us again. Okay, this spring sees a number of changes. We're joined today by Professor Steven Thomson, who's an agricultural economist with SRUC. He's going to give us one of his regular updates on a Rural Roundup, just in terms of all things policy, changes that are happening, and also to give a wee bit of an insight into maybe why they're happening as well. Welcome along, Steven.
Hi, how are you getting on?
I'm fine. We are just, as we're recording this, IAC's window is just a way to open. There's a number of key changes this year.
Yeah, I suppose the first key change for most not for most farms, but for farms that are got arable land, and that includes temporary grassland, is the introduction of ecological focus area for many farmers that previously were exempt from having to comply with that rule because they had a derogation because they had either 75% of their arable area was under temporary grass and or 75% of their holding or their business was under permanent grass and rough grazing, etc. And that derogation is gone as of this year, which means then a number of farms are facing this new EFA options that they're going to have to do. And there's been 4 new options brought in to try and make it easier for grassland farms, because the ecological focus area, the focus areas were designed originally for arable lands, with arable in mind, rather than for grass grazing areas. So it's hard to put in a field margin, etc., or do a cover crop on grassland. So they had to bring in some new measures. So everyone will have to comply with that. If you've got more than 15 hectares of arable and temporary grassland, TGRS 1 to 5 crop codes, then you will have to comply and put 5% of that area into these new measures. It's slightly more complex because, as you will be well aware, 1 hectare is not on the ground doesn't mean a hectare in EFA terms, because there are weightings associated with things. So it's important that people understand what those weightings are and what their options are in order to meet these requirements.
We're certainly getting a lot of queries, farmers, and it is dawning that they're probably going to have to do something different from the past. One thing we'll also always get, and I think it's just human nature, why change? Why is it? Why are things different this year?
So the justification element is that the Scottish Government have committed to supporting farmers with direct support, but the quid pro quo of that is that there is also expectations that there's going to be more asks in terms of delivery for biodiversity, for nature, for climate, and this is one approach to doing that. So this is the first stage in delivering more for nature, more for climate, in terms of conditionality, and then you can see it in the Scottish Suckler Beef Support Scheme, SSBSS, where the conditionality came in with 410 day calving interval on the dams. And again, that is a condition that was set to try and make the support payment actually start delivering a bit more for in that instance for climate. So the justification is quite clear, I think. Even though farmers may not react well to it, that is the kind of future model that we've signed up to through the Agricultural and Rural Communities Act that was passed in 2024, where the second tier is a conditional tier within the structure of payments. The first tier in that structure is on base payments. And the government, again, if you go back to the last 3 NFUS conferences, there's been various different commitments by the Scots Government. And the First Minister's committed to 70% being directed towards, a minimum of 70% being directed towards direct support in Scotland going forward. And within that, 70% of the 70% will be going into Tier 1, which is the direct support element. That's the non-conditional part. It's the main basic payment element. And you can see the ratios being very similar to what we've currently got in terms of BPS v greening. The greening payments are about 33% of everyone's BPS plus greening. But currently only those that are main cropping people will be doing any sort of real greening activity. Most of the upland farmers will be doing very little greening activity at all. And the discussion has been that permanent grassland may come into that ecological focus area model in the future. That's unlikely before 2028. And the other bit that people need to be aware of is it's 5% this year, but it's rising to 7% next year. So if people will have to have 7% of their land, or 7% of the weighted area. So if you do things like cover crop, it comes in at a weighting of 0.3, so you have to do 3 times as many hectares in order to meet the requirement. So it is slightly complex, but it's a lot of people were very negative about it when I first started looking into this nearly a year ago. And now I'm hearing, people are largely finding ways in order to comply without too much effort in the farms. But you were at the cutting edge, so you might find something totally different.
I think the increased flexibility is welcome. I think there's something for everybody, and it, it's finding the option that suits them, and that could be totally different from their neighbour. It's finding what suits them and making it work for them, because there are options that are quite attractive in some cases. The fact that you can use fodder crops now as a green cover, that's a boost to a lot of guys. Certainly if you've got feeding lambs and things like that. So there is opportunities out there. There's no doubt about that.
I think for the arable farmers that have been used to doing the 5%, it's not such a big change. It's just the extra conditions for things like the grass margins that's maybe going to be tricky for some. If they've already got a narrow grass margin established somewhere, they're going to have to widen it and sow something into it. So that's a bit of a tricky one to swallow. But as you were saying, George, there is, for a mixed farming situation, I feel that there's loads of choice there. That the likes of the low input grassland is another good one. If someone's got grassland that they can put aside for that, I think that's going to help a lot of people out to meet that target. And as you were saying, Stephen, this greening percentage has always been there. The grassland farmers were still getting the greening payment, as you say, just weren't having to do anything for it. So I suppose it's just bringing everyone in line, I guess.
Yeah, but it is always challenging for people to make those step changes. And I found it fascinating when I was looking at the numbers, and I thought a lot more dairy farms would come in. But then there's a lot of dairy farms where TGRS doesn't exist. They may be doing permanent grassland reseed, so they may have a fodder crop in, but by the time your SAF form comes back in, it's back in permanent grassland. And that kind of model means that not all of the dairy farms are in, and that's one of the reasons I think eventually permanent grassland will come into this model. And the government have been looking at options for permanent grassland, whether it's wetland management, rush management, managing the grassland for biodiversity, those kind of things, stitching in clover. All of those kind of things are in the mix just now in terms of the melting pot that might be a future EFA scheme for permanent grassland. But the challenge here is that the existing measures changed, the hedgerow measures changed in terms of the gaps. You had your fallow areas in terms of the mix that you have to sow into in terms of flowering species, legumes. So there was a lot of changes that happened. It wasn't just, oh, you guys are coming in. It's you guys are coming in, and you all of you that are existing compliant with this, you're going to have to make changes too. And I get the industry's frustration in that, but again, as I said, the Scottish government have taken a different approach to England and are continuing with direct support payments in Scotland.
I think, in a sense, the way the cereal job is at the moment, and we're also now having a lot of conversations with folk that, bearing in mind it's going to be 7% in 2027, folk are almost looking at it as a two-stage process. And having the winter, certainly in our area, we've had a lot of rain this side of Christmas, and it's making a decision quite easy to start preparing for next year, putting the margins in place, or even sowing a diverse grass lay, making sure it's good to go for next year. So there's a bit of preparation going ahead for the following year as well.
And undoubtedly, some of them will already be, well, the numbers show that there are people, quite a large proportion of the crop farms are already doing more than 7% already. So, the people don't just go to the 5%. They quite often are delivering more in their existing terms. And that's just the nature of the job, I think, is that people, if they're sowing a bit of a field for cover crops, will or catch crop, they're not just going to sow half the field, they're going to sow the whole thing. And there's probably going to be some smart ways of how people record what's in the ground. So if you're in an LFA area and you're used to claiming arable silage for crop for stock feed, you may declare half of your field as just a undersown barley crop, and then the rest of the field as for stock feed, and then that way you're covered in terms of your catch crop option. So there'll be ways that people can meet this in very different ways, as you said.
Do you think there's likely to be further changes to the option guidance for when the 7% comes in 2027, or do you think this is the final options that people will have to choose from for next year?
I don't know, to be honest, but what I've found is that the ARPID officials that I've been dealing with, when I was doing research for them on what the compliance costs, etc., looked like, and the more I got into it, the more I got worried that some of the regions or some areas wouldn't be able to comply. So Orkney, you didn't have hedgerows, you don't have trees really growing, and then the rotation. There was this whole discussion about whether the arable silage for crop for stock feed could be used or not in EFA terms, and they were really good at saying, look, we'll look at our guidance, we'll look at how it's being interpreted across the different offices and try and get some consistency. And they've continually said, if there are new options or options that we think or people think should be included, we're open to listening and seeing what they look like. So I think they've shown some flexibility in this process, and they were engaging with agents and seed merchants in order to try and get a diverse set of opinion before it was implemented.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing. The industry have had to try and catch up as well. We had an interesting visit out to Dodds of Haddington, a seed merchant in East Lothian, and them just trying to get up to speed to get the right numbers of seeds that they're going to need to provide people with the seed mixes for, the likes of the fallow or the floristically enhanced grass margins. But I suppose with my biodiversity hat on, I think it'll be nice to see some rich diversity in these new margins and fallow areas. So I'm hoping that whilst it's a pain for farmers to plan and implement these areas, that they'll get some enjoyment out of it too, and that there'll be some nice habitats created.
Indeed, and I think that's the whole objective of what they're trying to achieve with it. So, yeah, hopefully it can enrich in the farmland as well. So it's not just a thing you have to do. It actually may be beneficial in a lot of instances.
Okay, and Stephen, moving away from the EFA changes, what else is coming down the tracks?
Well, I suppose everybody's aware of the calving interval for the Suckler beef scheme. So that 410 days, we need to see what the analysis shows up in terms of any change performance. There is pressure for that number to change, for it to come down. Whether it will or not, I can't tell you. I really don't know. But there have been discussions about trying to lower that to 405 or 400 days, and I suspect over time that number will be there will be pressure to push that number down. So that's one of the things we know. We know the whole farm plan is in play. Not a lot of people probably know that there's no penalties associated with it last year. There's no penalties associated with this year, unless the government change the legislation before the SAF window opens, which is impossible now. So there are elements within it. Now, some people may opt not to do the whole farm plan elements, but remember in the legislation, if you've not done all of the elements by 2028, and in 2028 a nutrient management plan comes into the whole farm planning system. So it's not just the existing 5 measures, it's the Scottish Parliament made sure that, or they inputted the nutrient management plan by 2028. So all of these things are in place, so it's better for farmers probably to get on and actually do some of these elements, so it's not all having to be done at the last minute. The other things that we kind of know is that there's a second round of the Future Farming Investment Scheme where there's £14.25 million available. I don't know when it's going to be launched, and I don't know the details of it, but I know there have been meetings between stakeholders and the government on how that scheme will operate, and what lessons can be learned from the last round, where some people were unfortunate not to get supported, and some people, and quite a lot of people, did get support. And then we've got a rural support plan that I'm not sure when it's going to get published, but it should give us the 5-year window of how the government are going to support the industry. And the First Minister committed at the NFUS conference to a period of stability until 2030. So I don't think the industry is going to see any major changes to the way their support is being distributed until 2030. Once 2030 comes on, I think there'll be quite significant changes in terms of BPS regions. So currently the thinking is about merging regions 2 and 3, so that if you're having to do conditionality on rough grazing areas, then rough grazing areas are all one and the same thing. Now that will cause a bit of pain because we've got historically the region 2 payments are over £40 a hectare and region 3 is 13-ish quid a hectare. How do you merge the two of them? And of course the SUS scheme is associated with the sheep upland support scheme. It is associated with region 3. So these are quite complex things to get to sort out in their own right. And then within region 1, there's been a lot of discussion about, do we need to actually separate out grassland from arable land? And if we separate them out, then it makes it maybe easier to put minimum stocking densities on grassland and or on rough grazing hectares. And that would then allow the government to do what certainly the Agriculture Minister Fairley has talked about, which is supporting active farming. So active farming, I think there'll be there already is, re-emphasis on refocus on how do we actually support activity, and those that are truly active. And that means, I think, things like alternative practice. You'll be aware of that option in the SAF form. Alternative practice may disappear. And that alternative practice was brought in because if you've been in this job as long as I have, you remember all these things. When the single farm payment came in 2005, there was no real activity requirements on rough grazing areas. It was just that you had to comply with GEEC. And then what people were doing was they were basically buying in entitlements and then activating them on mountainsides with no real activity. So that then led to what was called the Scottish clause in EU terms, is that you could put in minimum activity requirements. Scotland had their 0.05, which is about a third of a sheep per hectare, minimum activity on rough grazing areas. And the European Commission insisted we brought in this thing called alternative practice, which is an environmental assessment on each hectare. We've now seen the Region 1 alternative practice get to nearly 70,000 hectares, which is equivalent of about £15 million worth of support, where somebody's declaring that they're not actually agriculturally active. Now, that's not saying the land's not been farmed and maybe rented out, somebody else is grazing it or doing something on it. So I think there's going to be a refocus on how do we actually target support active farmers and or crofters. And I think the industry will probably like that. So when I've been speaking to farmers and discuss these things, that's the kind of thing that gets a big tick box from their perspectives. So I think that is one of the major changes, that region, looking at the regions and then focusing on activity. The other one that appears to be capturing probably quite a lot of minds is, do we actually need a small producer scheme? And by that, I mean, if you're in receipt of under £4,000 of total support, or 5,000, whatever the number may be, then you're in a lighter scheme. You may not have to do all the whole farm plan elements because the compliance costs are quite a negative thing for people. In that small producers have got higher compliance cost for each pound of money, or for each pound of support that they receive. So, there could be a new scheme or a scheme that is a lighter touch for small producers. That would be a win for the industry, for the small producers. It would be less burdensome, but it would also be a win for the government, and then it would reduce the administrative burden that they have in assessing, making sure there's compliance with all these small producers. And the SAF numbers are quite clear, is that, so this year's been the biggest drop I've seen in the SAF, or last year, 2025. We saw 500 businesses drop out of the SAF system last year alone. So we're now down to about 17,000 SAF applications, whereas 10 years ago we were well over 18,000. So those are some of the major changes that we're seeing.
And just to pick up on that last point there, Stephen, there's loads to talk about within that, but the number of SAF forms dropping, are you thinking that's because people don't want to have to comply with all the new whole farm plan regulations, or do you think it's a combination of that and maybe smaller businesses merging with larger ones or something?
Indeed, and there's lots to unpick in it. Anecdotally, a lot of small producers decided the whole farm plan, the really small recipients, they're not receiving an awful lot of support. Anecdotally, quite a few of them decided not to bother. And also, interestingly, speaking to some of your colleagues, some of the people that were declaring alternative practice may not have actually declared or decided that the whole farm plan element is just something just too far for them, so they'll just rent out their land or rent out their entitlements. And as you say, you naturally get units joining up and businesses joining or expanding, and even within families where there may have been 2 units are suddenly becoming 1 unit. So there's a lot to unpick within it, but undoubtedly we've seen small producers walk out the system this year.
When I started with SAC, and that's 10 years ago, being a guy from the East Coast, LFASS was a bit of a mystery to me on an IACS form, and I was told, don't worry, it's going to wait to change. 10 years later, LFASS is still on the go. Is it going to be evolving in the near future?
LFASS is, no, you said it's a mystery to you. I would say it's a mystery to nearly everybody in Scotland, in that everybody knows what the scheme is, but it's really, really complex to work out what your payments are and how they've been derived. So the industry is repeatedly talking about rebasing, and the rebasing is that you've got multiple elements within this. So your grazing categories, there's 4 grazing categories within LFAS. They're all determined by historic stocking densities. So how many livestock units per hectare did you have back in the day? There's also the proportion of those livestock units that are cattle. That affects your cattle uplift, whether you get a 1.35 uplift or a 1.7 uplift. And your activity also, the livestock units per hectare, also are used for your minimum maximum stocking densities. So the number of hectares you declare get adjusted based on whether or not you're above or below the minimum or maximum. And all of those numbers are historically based. So they're now based mostly, for most farms, are based in 2010. And that's what the industry dislike about it. That scheme could be, the LFAS scheme could be focusing much more on current activity if there was a rebasing. And that's what the industry are asking for. The challenges, I think, for the government are, once you start going down that route, then all of the attention goes on to an effort is on rebasing LFAS rather than on how do we get the big prize, which is the basic payment and greening support and the regions and activity all sorted for 2030. So it's not easy to do both at the same time. Because there is a finite resource within Scottish Government that can deliver on this. And I think that's part of the problem, is that everybody can rationally see that LFAS rebasing would possibly be a good thing to do in terms of supporting activity. But that's 65 million pot, because that's what it is, a 65 million pot. Or do we get the 400 million that is associated with the BPS and greening, correct? And that's a real challenge, and that's the juggling act that policymakers and the politicians are having to deal with at this moment in time, because there's lots of noises coming from all different parts of the room in order to deliver on multiple objectives that they have. I personally think LFAS needs rethought. I like elements of it. I like the fact that it targets support or could target support activity. But I dislike the fact that it doesn't take any account into peripherality and delivery costs of fertilizers or haulage costs for cattle or sheep, depending on where you're located in the country. So I think there's a need for us to reconsider peripherality in the mix, as well as the disadvantaged nature of land. And I think that will come by 2030. So it's part of the big prize is reconfiguring a future LFA support scheme.
You mentioned as well, Stephen, about the FFIS scheme. We're sort of anticipating that to be open in the summer, I'm guessing, similar to last year. There was obviously quite a lot of feedback about that given to the Scottish Government. Are we expecting any sort of insight into how it was scored that might help us with applications for this year?
I think that I've not really been involved in any of those discussions, but I did see that ARPID had put out various different how many people did X, Y, Z, and I know that there was because I've listened to the parliamentary debates on it. I know that there was concerns from the industry that the criteria weren't being followed, but when I've spoken to senior officials, then it was quite a clear list of categories that they went through, and it wasn't the case that if you were a young entrant or a crofter or islander, then it was a big tick and you were guaranteed to get in. They seemingly were looking at what was the benefit to nature or climate of the equipment that you were then going for. So they were weighting, I think, and again, this is just through conversations, they were weighting things based on potential outcomes, which is nature and climate. Now, where a lot of the contention has been is that I think people were filtered out where they couldn't reconcile what was claimed on the application form with what they've got in the SAF system. So people have to be really careful that if they're saying there's a new entrant in the farm or a young farmer, then it says that in the system. Because if it doesn't say that in the system, there's a conflict of what is being declared at some point in time. If you previously received SCAGS grants or FIS grants, then you're going to have to put that down. And again, I understand there were instances where people were saying that they previously hadn't received capital grants through various different things, yet the government system told them that they actually had. So I think there's a real challenge, not a real challenge. There are lessons to be learned, I think, on all sides in how to make sure that the applicant is putting in the correct information. And having a little bit of thought about, and I think supporting statements would be useful within this, because I think quite a lot of people just put in applications without any supporting statement as to what this was going to achieve. And I think making that a bit clearer for people would possibly be beneficial for that application process. But as I say, I've got nothing to do with that. I just hear these things.
Yeah, I mean, there was nowhere to put supporting statements, and there was only one text box. I think that's what left people feeling frustrated. So yeah, any improvements to that would maybe help.
Yeah, but I mean, the industry themselves wanted a simple application form, and they got the simplest of application form. This is the problem: is you could go down the route of showing previously grant schemes of this of up to 20,000. I remember seeing things that you had to submit profit and loss accounts, balance sheets, and proper application process, which I don't think many people would welcome. But again, it's somewhere, maybe it lies somewhere in the middle in the supporting statement box. Putting in a supporting statement explaining how it's going to help biodiversity or reduce emissions and or improve productivity. Those are the things that I think can improve an application process.
Absolutely. In terms of capital grants, then, Stephen, is that all that you've heard murmurings about? Can we expect anything else in the pipeline?
Well, you've got the agri-tourism one that is on the go at the moment as well. So, and then there's the small producers scheme, which is it's about not just micro producers, small producers. So there's various different small pots, and then the food processing marketing grant schemes. There are all these different elements, but for mainstream farmers, it's unlike England where there is a capital grant scheme. And I quite often get farmers saying, "Oh, we could do with that," and I'm like, "Okay." But they don't have a direct support payment. You can use your direct support payment as a capital grant if you like. You can choose what you do with your support in Scotland. In England, it's if you put in an application for a piece of equipment, you have to buy that piece of equipment. So the flexibility is retained within Scotland that people can choose to do with the money or spend the money as they choose fit. So I don't think there will be much more because government budgets are really, really tight at this moment in time. So I don't think we're going to find a magic money tree that's going to put more money into capital unless we take it away from other parts within the existing support structures. Again, it's this balancing act. If we want capital support, where do we take it from within the government's existing budget for agriculture or land? The other one that we haven't probably mentioned is continued professional development. So within the agriculture, the Act, the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act, there is a section on CPD, continued professional development, and there have been discussions between government and stakeholders about what CPD might look like, whether it be compulsory, how many events would you have to go to? Do attending FAS events? What kind of point system? All of those things would have to get ironed out before anything could be launched on CPD. So I think in the next year you will see more discussion about the continued professional development coming out of the Scottish Government, along with maybe a future agriculture knowledge and innovation system. The next stage of the Farm Advisory Service might look like from 2030 onwards.
That's fantastic, Stephen. I think you've given us all a real insight into some of the changes that are happening right now and some potential ones for the future. So we'll definitely get you back on again soon to keep everyone up to date. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rural Roundup. We'll see you back here next month with our next episode. This episode was hosted by George Chalmers and Mary Jane Lawrie, featured our guest Steven Thomson, and was produced by George Gawley and edited by Cameron Waugh.
The Farm Advisory Service Podcast. Audio advice on livestock, crops and soils, environment, rural business, and more. Brought to you in association with the Scottish Government.